"You look scared, sir," said the poor girl on the plane. The Mafia boss never expected she would change. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 from Chicago to Miami hummed with the quiet efficiency of expensive comfort. Vincent Torino adjusted his Italian leather jacket and glanced at his Rolex. 2:47 p.m., right on schedule. The flight attendant had already brought him his usual. Bourbon, neat, no ice. He preferred everything in his life to be predictable, controlled. At 42, Vinny commanded respect through fear across Chicago's South Side. His dark hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was always perfectly styled. His grey eyes, cold as winter steel, rarely showed emotion. Today's trip to Miami was business, a territorial dispute that needed his personal attention. The Rodriguez family down there had been cutting into his operations, and diplomatic solutions had been exhausted. He opened his laptop, reviewing the files his lieutenant, Tony, had prepared. Names, addresses, financial records, everything needed to remind the Miami players why Chicago families weren't to be crossed. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, and Vinny settled into his routine of work and bourbon. Beside him in seat 2B sat a young woman, probably college-aged, with long dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded university sweatshirt and clutched a worn paperback novel. Her sneakers were scuffed, and her small backpack looked like it had seen better days. She kept glancing around the first-class cabin with wide eyes, clearly out of her element. Vinny had noticed her earlier during boarding. She'd shown her ticket to the flight attendant 3 times, convinced there had been a mistake. Some mix-up with upgrades, he assumed. He'd learned long ago not to pay attention to ordinary people. They were just background noise in his carefully orchestrated world. The plane accelerated down the runway, and Vinny felt his shoulders tense involuntarily. Flying was the one thing that remained outside his control, the one situation where his money and influence meant nothing against the laws of physics and weather. He gripped his bourbon glass tighter and forced himself to focus on the laptop screen. 20 minutes into the flight, everything changed. The plane hit an air pocket and dropped suddenly, sending drinks flying and overhead bins rattling. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain seated." Another violent jolt shook the aircraft, and this time the lights flickered. Vinny's laptop slammed shut and his bourbon glass shattered against the armrest. His knuckles went white as he gripped the seat arms, and despite every effort to maintain his composure, he could feel sweat beading on his forehead. The plane lurched again, more violently than before. Outside the window, Vinny could see the wing flexing in ways that seemed impossible, unnatural. His breathing became shallow, rapid. For a man who had stared down the barrel of guns and walked away from explosive confrontations, this helplessness in the sky was his one true terror. "You look scared, sir." The voice was soft, gentle, with a slight accent he couldn't immediately place. Vinny turned to see the young woman in 2B looking at him with genuine concern. Her brown eyes held no judgment, no recognition of who he was, just simple human compassion. "I'm fine," he managed through gritted teeth, but another violent shake of the plane contradicted his words. "Flying can be really scary," she continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I read somewhere that turbulence feels much worse than it actually is. The planes are built to handle way more than this." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small packet of crackers. "Sometimes eating something helps. My grandmother always said an empty stomach makes everything worse." Vinny stared at her, speechless. Here was this kid, she couldn't be more than 19, offering comfort to a complete stranger, while the plane felt like it might shake apart. She had no idea she was talking to a man who could end lives with a phone call, who had built an empire on violence and intimidation. "Emma Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand as the plane stabilized slightly. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to bother you. You looked like you might need someone to talk to." Rodriguez. The name hit Vinny like a physical blow. This girl shared the surname of the Miami family he was traveling to deal with. The irony was almost too much to process. "Vincent," he replied automatically, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, confident despite her obvious youth and circumstances. "Nice to meet you, Vincent. Is this your first time flying?" He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "No, just don't particularly enjoy it. I get that. This is actually my first time in first class," Emma admitted with a small smile. "There was some mix-up with the booking and they upgraded me. I keep expecting someone to realize the mistake and move me back to coach." The turbulence continued, but somehow her presence made it bearable. Vinny found himself actually listening as she talked about her scholarship to the University of Miami, her plans to study social work, her hopes of helping kids in tough neighborhoods. She spoke with a passion and optimism that seemed foreign to him, like she was speaking a language he'd forgotten how to understand. As the plane finally began its descent into Miami, the turbulence subsided, but something in Vinny had fundamentally shifted. Emma had spent the last hour telling him about her life, growing up in a small apartment in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood, working 2 jobs to help support her mother and younger brother, earning the scholarship that would change her family's trajectory. "My mum cleaned office buildings downtown for 12 years, Emma said, looking out the window as Miami's skyline came into view. "Sometimes she'd take me with her during summer breaks when I was little. So I'd see all these important-looking people in their suits, making decisions that affected thousands of people. I always wondered what it would be like to have that kind of influence, but to use it to actually help people, instead of just making money." Vinny studied her profile as she gazed out the window. There was something luminous about her hope, something that made his chest feel tight in a way he couldn't explain. When was the last time someone had talked to him about helping people? When was the last time anyone had looked at him without fear or calculation? "What about you, Vincent? What do you do?" Emma asked, turning back to him. The question hung in the air between them. How could he possibly explain? That he ran numbers and protection rackets, that he'd ordered beatings and worse, that just this morning he'd approved the collection of a debt that would probably leave a man hospitalized. "Business," he said simply. "Import and export." It wasn't entirely a lie. His operations did involve moving products across state lines, though those products weren't exactly legal, and his business practices wouldn't pass any ethics review. "That sounds exciting. Do you travel a lot?" "More than I'd like." Another truth, though probably not in the way she imagined. The plane touched down with barely a bump, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Emma carefully placed her book back in her worn backpack and stood to retrieve a single carry-on bag from the overhead bin. Vinny watched her struggle with the heavy bag, and before he could stop himself, he stood and easily lifted it down for her. "Thank you," she said, her smile bright and genuine. "You're very kind." Kind. When was the last time anyone had called him kind? The word felt strange, unfamiliar, like putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. They walked together toward the gate, and Vinny felt an unexpected reluctance to part ways. At the terminal entrance, Emma turned to him one more time. "I know this might sound silly, but thank you for letting me talk during the flight. I was actually pretty nervous too, not about flying, but about starting over in a new city. Talking to you made it feel less scary somehow." She pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket and wrote something on it. "This is my number. I know you're probably busy with your business stuff, but if you ever want to grab coffee or something, I don't know anyone in Miami yet, and you seem like a decent person." Vinny took the paper, staring at the carefully written numbers. Emma Rodriguez, the girl who had no idea she was handing her contact information to a man who'd come to Miami to send a message to people with her exact surname. He started, but didn't know how to finish. "No pressure," Emma said quickly, misreading his hesitation. "I just thought, well, you never know when you might need a friend in a new city, right?" Friend. Another word that felt foreign in his mouth. "Take care of yourself, Emma Rodriguez," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. "You too, Vincent. And hey, next time you fly, remember that turbulence can't actually hurt you. The plane is stronger than it feels." She walked away then, her small figure quickly swallowed by the crowd of travelers. Vinny stood motionless, watching until he couldn't see her anymore, the piece of paper with her number feeling heavier than it should in his hand. His phone buzzed. A text from Tony. "Boss, car's waiting outside. The Miami boys are expecting you at 8. Everything's set up like you wanted." Reality crashed back over him like a cold wave. He had business to attend to, territory to protect, respect to maintain. The Rodriguez family in Miami needed to understand their place in the hierarchy, needed to learn that Chicago's reach extended far beyond the Midwest. But as he walked toward the exit, Vinny couldn't shake the memory of Emma's voice saying, "You look scared, sir," or the way she'd offered him crackers with the same casualness most people offered threats. He couldn't forget her dreams of helping kids in tough neighborhoods, or the way she'd called him kind. For the first time in 20 years, Vincent Torino questioned whether the man he'd become was the man he wanted to be. The black Lincoln Continental waiting outside Miami International Airport was exactly what Vinny expected. Tinted windows, leather interior, and a driver who knew better than to make small talk. As they pulled away from the terminal, Vinny stared out at the palm trees and bright sunshine, a stark contrast to Chicago's October chill. His phone rang almost immediately. Tony's gravelly voice filled the car through the Bluetooth connection. "Boss, everything's arranged for tonight. The Rodriguez crew agreed to meet at Café Versailles in Little Havana. Neutral ground like you requested. Marco's already down there with 3 of our guys keeping an eye on things." "Good. What do we know about their operation?" "It's bigger than we thought. Miguel Rodriguez runs a tight ship. Drugs, numbers, some legitimate businesses as fronts. He's got maybe 30 guys working for him, mostly family. The thing is, boss, they're not exactly backing down. Word is they're prepared for this meeting to go either way." Vinny processed this information while watching Miami's skyline grow larger through the windshield. Standard territorial dispute, the kind he'd handled dozens of times before. Show strength. Negotiate from a position of power. Make it clear that cooperation was preferable to conflict, but that conflict was always an option. "Any family connections we should know about?" he asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "Yeah, actually. Miguel's got a niece who just started college here. Smart kid, apparently, full scholarship. Her name's Emma Rodriguez," Vinny finished quietly. "You know her, boss?" Vinny looked down at the piece of paper still in his hand. Emma's phone number written in careful, neat handwriting. "We've met. What's her story?" "Clean as a whistle. Honor student, works 2 jobs, helps support her family back in Chicago. She's not involved in the business at all. Miguel keeps all the family kids away from operations. Probably doesn't even know what her uncle really does for a living." Of course she didn't. That explained her openness, her willingness to trust a stranger on a plane. Emma Rodriguez lived in a different world, one where people helped each other without ulterior motives, where kindness wasn't a strategy or a weakness to be exploited. The car pulled up to the Fontainebleau Hotel, where Vinny always stayed when conducting business in Miami. The opulent lobby, with its sweeping curves and crystal chandeliers, usually made him feel powerful, in control. Today, it just felt hollow. In his suite overlooking the ocean, Vinny poured himself another bourbon and tried to focus on the evening ahead. He spread out the files Tony had prepared: financial records, surveillance photos, detailed maps of Rodriguez territory. Miguel Rodriguez stared back at him from a grainy surveillance photo. Mid-50s, graying hair, serious expression. He looked like a man who'd worked his way up from nothing, just like Vinny had. But every time Vinny tried to concentrate on strategy, he heard Emma's voice. "I always wondered what it would be like to have that kind of influence, but to use it to actually help people instead of just making money." His phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, he thought it might be Emma, but it was just Marco confirming the evening's arrangements. Vinny set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the endless blue of the Atlantic. 23 years ago, he'd started as muscle for the Torino family operations. Back then, he'd told himself he was protecting his neighborhood, keeping the streets safe for kids like his younger sister. When had that mission twisted into something else entirely? When had protection become extortion and justice become revenge? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Tony entered without waiting for permission, carrying a garment bag and wearing his usual expression of barely contained violence. "Brought your dinner jacket, boss. Figured you'd want to look sharp for the Rodriguez meeting." "Tony, how long have we worked together?" The question seemed to surprise his lieutenant. 15 years, give or take. Why? "In all that time, have you ever wondered if we're the good guys?" Tony's laugh was harsh, humorless. "Good guys? Boss, there ain't no good guys in this business. There's winners and losers, predators and prey. We've survived this long because we're better predators than most. But what if... Look, boss, I don't know what's gotten into you today, but you better snap out of it. The Rodriguez family is waiting for us to show weakness so they can expand into our territory. They've been testing our borders for months. Tonight, we remind them why that's a bad idea. That's how this works." Tony was right, of course. This was how it worked. This was the world Vinny had chosen, the life he'd built. There was no room for doubt, no space for the kind of innocence Emma Rodriguez carried like a light inside her. But as Vinny put on his dinner jacket and checked his appearance in the mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was putting on a costume. playing a role that no longer fit quite right. Café Versailles buzzed with its usual evening energy, families sharing traditional Cuban meals, old men arguing politics over coffee, the warm sounds of Spanish conversation filling the air. It was the kind of place where generations gathered, where community mattered more than individual ambition. Vinny arrived at exactly 8 p.m., flanked by Tony and Marco. They moved through the restaurant like sharks through water, other diners instinctively sensing danger and giving them space. Miguel Rodriguez was already seated at a corner table with 2 of his own men, his back to the wall, dark eyes tracking every movement in the room. "Mr. Torino." Miguel stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm, his manner respectful, but not deferential. "Thank you for coming to Miami. I hope we can resolve our differences like civilized men." Up close, Miguel Rodriguez looked even more like Emma than the surveillance photos had suggested. The same intelligent brown eyes, the same determined set to the jaw. But where Emma's expression held hope and openness, Miguel's was guarded, careful. "Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate you taking the time to meet." They sat across from each other, their respective lieutenants flanking them like bookends. The waitress approached nervously. Clearly word had spread about the nature of this dinner meeting. "Just coffee," Miguel said. "Black." "The same," Vinny agreed. For several minutes, they sized each other up in silence. Miguel Rodriguez was not what Vinny had expected. There was intelligence in his eyes, a dignity that reminded Vinny uncomfortably of Emma's quiet strength on the plane. "Let me be direct," Miguel finally said. "I know why you're here. My operations in Miami have been successful, and that success has apparently caught Chicago's attention. But this is my city, Mr. Torino. My family has been here for 3 generations. "I respect that," Vinny replied carefully. "But your Miami success has come at the expense of Chicago interests. The shipping routes you've established, the suppliers you've cultivated, some of those relationships belong to us first. Business evolves. Markets change. Surely a man of your experience understands that. It was a chess match, each man probing for weakness while maintaining the facade of civility. This was familiar territory for Vinny, the kind of negotiation he'd conducted countless times. But something felt different tonight, off balance. "I have a proposition," Miguel continued. "Instead of territorial disputes, what if we discussed partnership? Miami is a gateway to South America. Chicago controls northern distribution. We could be allies instead of enemies." It was actually a reasonable offer, the kind of deal that would have made sense to Vinny just 24 hours ago. But now, looking at Miguel Rodriguez across the table, all he could think about was Emma's voice. "My mom cleaned office buildings downtown for 12 years. There's something you should know," Vinny said suddenly, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully formed the thought. "I met your niece today, on the plane from Chicago." Miguel's expression didn't change, but Vinny caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Emma is not part of this business. She's never been part of this world." "I know. She told me about her scholarship, her plans to help kids in tough neighborhoods. She's a remarkable young woman." "Yes, she is." Miguel's voice carried a warning now. "She represents everything good about our family, everything worth protecting. I would do anything to keep her safe and innocent." The implication hung heavy between them. Threaten Emma, and all negotiations would end permanently. "She doesn't know what you do for a living, does she?" Vinny asked. "No, and it will stay that way." Miguel leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Torino, I'm going to be honest with you. I built this operation not for power or glory, but to create opportunities for the next generation of my family. Emma's scholarship, her brother's college fund, my daughter's medical school tuition, everything I do is so they can live in the legitimate world, the clean world." Vinny felt something crack open in his chest. When was the last time he'd done anything for someone else's future? When was the last time his actions had created rather than destroyed? "She called me kind," Vinny said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm sorry? Your niece. During the flight, she called me kind. I can't remember the last time anyone said that about me." Miguel studied him with new attention. "Perhaps that's because you haven't given them reason to." The simple statement hit Vinny like a physical blow. Around them, the cafe continued its evening rhythm. Families sharing meals, children laughing. The ordinary magic of people caring for each other. When had he forgotten that this was what life was supposed to look like? Tony shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. This wasn't how these meetings typically went. There should have been threats by now, demonstrations of power, clear lines drawn in the sand. Instead, Vinny found himself asking, "What if we found another way?" "What kind of way?" Miguel asked carefully. "What if—" Vinny paused, hardly believing what he was about to suggest. "What if we talked about stepping back instead of expanding? About protecting what matters, instead of taking what doesn't belong to us?" The silence that followed was deafening. Tony was staring at him like he'd lost his mind, and Miguel's lieutenants looked equally confused. But Miguel Rodriguez was watching Vinny with something that might have been understanding. "That," Miguel said slowly, "would be a very different conversation indeed." The meeting at Café Versailles ended unlike any business negotiation Vinny had ever conducted. Instead of territorial agreements or veiled threats, he and Miguel Rodriguez had spent 2 hours talking about family, responsibility, and the weight of choices made in darkness. No formal agreements were reached, but something more significant had occurred, a recognition between two men that the paths they'd chosen were leading them away from everything they'd originally meant to protect. Back at the Fontainebleau, Tony paced Vinny's suite like a caged animal, his frustration barely contained. "Boss, what the hell happened back there? We flew down here to establish dominance, to remind these people why they shouldn't mess with Chicago operations. Instead, you and Rodriguez spent the evening bonding over family values." Vinny loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, watching the moonlight reflect off the ocean through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Are you listening to yourself? This is business, not some feel-good movie. The other families are watching how we handle this Miami situation. Show weakness here, and we'll have problems from Detroit to New York." What if they're wrong? What if strength isn't about how much fear you can generate, but about knowing when to walk away from a fight? Tony stopped pacing and stared at him. "Okay, who are you, and what did you do with Vincent Torino? Yesterday you were ready to teach the Rodriguez family a lesson they'd never forget. Today you're talking like some kind of philosopher." Vinny pulled Emma's phone number from his pocket and stared at the careful handwriting. "Sometimes it just takes one person to make you see things differently." "One person?" "Boss, you met the Rodriguez girl for what? 3 hours on a plane? You don't even know her." "I know enough." Vinny walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I know she works 2 jobs to help support her family. I know she chose social work because she wants to help kids in tough neighborhoods. I know she offered crackers to a stranger during turbulence because she thought he looked scared. So what? The world is full of good people doing good things. That doesn't change who we are or what we do. Doesn't it?" Vinny turned to face his lieutenant. "Tony, when did you last do something purely because it was right? When did you last help someone who couldn't help you back?" Tony's expression softened slightly, confusion replacing anger. "Boss, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. Maybe you need some rest, some time to think clearly. Maybe I need to start thinking clearly for the first time in 20 years. The conversation was interrupted by Vinny's phone, buzzing with a text message. This time, it actually was from Emma. "Hi, Vincent. Just wanted to say thanks again for being so nice on the plane today. I'm settling into my dorm room now. Miami is amazing. Hope your business meetings go well. Emma." The message was accompanied by a photo. Emma grinning in front of her dormitory, the Miami sunset painting the sky orange and pink behind her. She looked radiant, full of possibility, untouched by the darkness that had consumed so much of Vinny's world. "Is that her?" Tony asked, reading over his shoulder. "Yeah. She has no idea who you are, does she?" "None whatsoever." Tony sat heavily in one of the suite's leather chairs. "Boss, you realize this is impossible, right? You can't just walk away from this life. There are obligations, responsibilities, people depend on you. People fear me, Tony. That's not the same thing. What about your crew back in Chicago? What about the territories we've built? The businesses we protect? You think the Morettis or the Castellanos are going to respect some spiritual awakening? They'll see weakness and move in." It was a valid point, and Vinny knew it. The world he'd built didn't allow for sudden changes of heart. There were debts to be paid, promises to be kept, enemies who would interpret any softness as an opportunity to strike. But as he looked at Emma's photo again, her genuine smile, her obvious joy at starting this new chapter of her life, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope that there might be another way to live. "Set up a meeting with the Chicago crew for when we get back," Vinny said finally. "All the lieutenants, all the captains, it's time for some changes." "What kind of changes?" "I don't know yet. but I know we can't keep doing things the same way forever." Tony stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Boss, for what it's worth, I've known you for 15 years. You're not a bad man. You've always tried to protect people, even if your methods were questionable. Maybe this girl just reminded you of who you used to be." After Tony left, Vinny sat alone with his thoughts and his bourbon. He picked up his phone several times, starting to type a response to Emma's message, then deleting it each time. What could he possibly say? How could he explain that her simple kindness had started an earthquake in his carefully constructed world? Finally, he typed, "Glad you're settling in well. Miami suits you. Take care of yourself, Emma." He hit send before he could change his mind, then immediately regretted it. What was he doing? This girl represented everything he'd never be. Innocent, hopeful, untainted by violence and moral compromise. She deserved better than the attention of someone like him. But even as he told himself to forget about Emma Rodriguez, Vinny found himself thinking about Miguel's words. Perhaps that's because you haven't given them reason to. What if it wasn't too late to become the kind of person who deserved to be called kind? 3 days later, Vinny found himself doing something he'd never done before in Miami, walking around without purpose, without agenda, without bodyguards. He'd sent Tony and Marco back to Chicago that morning, claiming he needed a few extra days to finalize details with the Rodriguez organization. In reality, he just wasn't ready to return to his old life, not yet. The University of Miami campus buzzed with the energy of young people pursuing their dreams. Students hurried between classes, backpacks slung over shoulders, faces bright with possibility. Vinny felt like an imposter walking among them in his $1,000 suit, a predator wandering through a flock of sheep. He told himself he wasn't looking for Emma, that this was just reconnaissance, understanding the territory. But when he spotted her sitting alone at a picnic table outside the student center, textbooks spread around her like a fortress, his heart jumped in a way that had nothing to do with business strategy. She was bent over what looked like a psychology textbook, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside her. Even from a distance, he could see the intense concentration on her face, the way she chewed her pen while thinking. She looked exactly like what she was, a serious student determined to make the most of her opportunity. Vinny almost turned around and left. This was Emma's world, her safe space, and he had no right to intrude. But as he hesitated, she looked up and their eyes met across the courtyard. Her face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Vincent!" She waved him over, already clearing space at her table. "What are you doing here?" "I had some business at the university," he lied smoothly. "Donation meetings with the administration." "That's so cool." "What kind of donation?" Vinny's mind raced. "Scholarship fund. For students from disadvantaged backgrounds." It was such a complete fabrication that he almost choked on the words. But Emma's smile grew even brighter. "That's amazing. There are so many kids who could use that kind of help. My scholarship literally changed my family's entire future." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Want to sit? I'm just studying for my developmental psychology midterm, but I could use a break." Against every instinct he'd developed over 20 years in organized crime, Vinny sat down at a picnic table in broad daylight with the niece of a man he'd come to Miami to intimidate. It was possibly the most dangerous thing he'd ever done, and paradoxically it felt like the safest place he'd ever been. "Developmental psychology?" he asked, genuinely curious. "It's all about how kids grow and learn, especially kids who've faced trauma or difficult circumstances. I want to understand how to help them heal, how to give them tools to build better lives." Emma's passion was evident in every word. "Some of these case studies are heartbreaking, though. Kids who've seen violence, who've grown up around crime and dysfunction. It's amazing how resilient they can be, but also how much damage can be done." Vinny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Miami breeze. How many children had been affected by his operations over the years? How many kids had grown up in neighborhoods where his presence meant fear, where his business practices had contributed to the cycle of violence and trauma Emma was studying? "It must be difficult," he said carefully, "reading about that kind of damage." "It is, but it's also hopeful in a way. The research shows that even kids from the worst circumstances can overcome their past if they have the right support, the right opportunities. Sometimes it just takes one person believing in them, one person showing them a different way to live." She looked directly at him as she said this, and Vinny felt like she could see straight through him, past the expensive clothes and careful facade to the scared, angry boy he'd once been. "What about you?" Emma asked. "Do you have kids?" "No." "Never married, no family?" The words came out more bitter than he'd intended. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people aren't meant for traditional family life. Maybe your contribution is different, like the scholarship fund you're setting up. The scholarship fund that didn't exist, for a foundation that was completely fictional. Vinny found himself wondering what it would actually cost to set up something like that. How many students like Emma could be helped with the money he currently spent on lawyer fees and hush money? "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you believe people can really change? I mean fundamentally change, not just surface adjustments, but completely transform who they are?" She considered the question seriously, the way she probably approached her psychology textbooks. "I think people can change if they really want to, and if they're willing to do the work. But it's not easy. The older we get, the more entrenched our patterns become. And sometimes people have built their entire identity around being a certain way, so changing means giving up everything they think they are. What if someone has done things, terrible things, things that hurt innocent people?" "You mean like criminals? People who've committed crimes?" Vinny nodded, not trusting his voice. "I think even then, yes. But they'd have to genuinely want to make amends to repair the damage they've caused. And they'd probably need help, therapy, support, maybe even legal consequences. Change without accountability isn't really change. It's just hiding. Change without accountability isn't really change." The words hit Vinny like a physical blow. How could he ever truly change without facing the consequences of 20 years of choices? How could he transform his life without acknowledging the damage he'd caused? "Why do you ask?" Emma said gently. "You look troubled." "Just thinking about some of the people I've encountered in business. People who've made questionable choices." Emma's phone buzzed with a reminder alarm. "Oh no, I have to get to my next class. Professor Martinez does not tolerate lateness." She gathered her books quickly, then paused. "Vincent, would you like to have dinner sometime? As friends, I mean. You seem like someone who could use a friend, and honestly, I could too. Starting over in a new city is lonelier than I expected." The invitation hung between them like a bridge Vinny knew he shouldn't cross. Emma Rodriguez represented everything good and pure in the world, everything he'd lost the right to touch. But looking at her hopeful expression, he found himself nodding. "I'd like that. Very much." "Great. How about tomorrow night? There's this little Cuban place near campus that I've been wanting to try, but I feel weird eating alone at restaurants." "Tomorrow sounds perfect." Emma smiled and hurried off toward her class, leaving Vinny alone at the picnic table surrounded by the dreams and ambitions of hundreds of young people. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself wondering what his own dreams might have been if he'd made different choices all those years ago. The restaurant Emma had chosen was nothing like the establishments Vinny usually frequented. La Cocina de Abuela was a tiny family-owned place, wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore, with mismatched chairs and tables that had seen decades of use. The walls were covered with faded photographs of Havana and handwritten testimonials from satisfied customers. It was the kind of place where authenticity mattered more than ambiance, where recipes were passed down through generations rather than created by celebrity chefs. Vinny arrived 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained by years of needing to assess every situation for potential threats. But as he sat in his rental car watching through the window, he realized this wasn't a business meeting, requiring strategy and contingency plans. This was dinner with a 19-year-old college student who had no idea she was breaking bread with one of Chicago's most feared criminals. Emma arrived exactly on time, walking from the direction of campus with that same confident stride he'd noticed on the plane. She'd changed from her university sweatshirt into a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful in the way that only very young, very hopeful people could look, as if the world still held unlimited possibilities. "Vincent," she waved when she spotted him getting out of his car. "Isn't this place perfect? I asked my roommate about authentic Cuban food, and she said this was where her grandmother takes her." Inside, the elderly owner greeted them in rapid Spanish, gesturing animatedly as he led them to a corner table. Emma responded in fluent Spanish, laughing at something the man said, clearly comfortable in a way that reminded Vinny of her Uncle Miguel's easy dignity. "What did he say?" Vinny asked as they settled into their seats. He said you look like a man who needs to eat more, and that he's going to make sure we get extra portions of everything. Emma grinned. Cuban grandparents believe food can solve any problem. And you speak Spanish fluently. My family's been in Chicago for 3 generations, but my grandmother insisted we maintain the language. She said you can't understand where you're going if you forget where you came from. The simple statement carried more weight than Emma probably realized. Where had Vinny come from? He'd grown up in the same kind of neighborhood Emma had, son of a factory worker and a seamstress who'd sacrificed everything so their children could have better lives. When had he forgotten that? The owner returned with plates of food they hadn't ordered. Ropa vieja, black beans and rice, sweet plantains, and fresh bread that steamed when he broke it open. The aromas were rich and comforting, reminding Vinny of Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house before everything had gone wrong. So tell me about your scholarship fund, Emma said, taking a bite of the tender beef. How did you decide to focus on education? Vinny had hoped she'd forgotten about his improvised story from the day before, but Emma's interest was genuine, expectant. He found himself thinking quickly, building a narrative that wasn't entirely false. I grew up in a tough neighborhood, he said slowly. A lot of kids I knew never had a real chance to escape that environment. I've been fortunate in business, and I suppose I want to give other kids the opportunities I never had. That's beautiful. What neighborhood? Southside Chicago, Little Italy area. Really? That's not far from where I grew up in Little Village. We probably shopped at some of the same stores. Emma's eyes lit up with connection. Did you know the Benedetto family? They ran the corner market on Halstead. Vinny's blood ran cold. He not only knew the Benedetto family, he'd been collecting protection money from their store for over a decade. Old Mr. Benedetto probably crossed himself every time Vinny's name was mentioned. The name sounds familiar, he managed. They're such good people. Mr. Benedetto used to give me free candy when my mom brought me to the store. I always wondered how small businesses like that survive in tough neighborhoods. They survive by paying men like me to make sure nothing bad happens to them, Vinny thought. And sometimes bad things happen anyway, despite the payments, because protection money was often just legalized extortion, dressed up in prettier language. Emma, he said suddenly, what would you think of someone who took money from honest people like the Benedettos, someone who used fear to make them pay for protection they shouldn't need? Emma paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, considering the question seriously. I think that person would probably tell themselves they were providing a necessary service, but really they'd be part of the problem, not the solution. The thing is, people like that usually aren't evil, just lost. They've convinced themselves that the world is so dangerous that intimidation is the only way to survive. And what if they wanted to change? To make amends? I'd say they'd have to start by stopping the behavior that was causing harm. Then they'd need to find ways to repair the damage they'd done. But Vincent, why are we talking about this? You're setting up scholarships and donating to universities. You're clearly one of the good guys. One of the good guys. If only she knew how wrong she was. The owner appeared again, this time carrying a plate of flan and 2 cups of strong Cuban coffee. Para la pareja hermosa, he said, with a wink that made Emma blush. What did he say this time? Vinny asked. He said, for the beautiful couple, Emma translated, her cheeks pink. I should probably explain that we're just friends. Should you? The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities that Vinny knew he had no right to explore. Emma was 19 years old, starting her life, full of dreams about helping people and making the world better. He was 42, carrying decades of violence and moral compromise, even if his feelings for her were genuine, and he was beginning to suspect they were more genuine than anything he'd felt in years. Pursuing them would be selfish beyond redemption. Vincent, Emma said softly, can I tell you something? Of course. I've been thinking about our conversation on the plane, about you being scared during the turbulence. There was something about that moment. You seemed so human, so real. Most of the men I've known try to act tough all the time, like admitting fear is some kind of weakness. But you let me see that you were frightened, and somehow that made you seem stronger, not weaker. Vinny stared at her across the small table, this remarkable young woman who somehow found strength in his moments of vulnerability. How could he tell her that everything she admired about him was built on a foundation of lies? Emma, what if I told you that I'm not the man you think I am? What if everything about me was different from what you've seen? I'd say that I'm a pretty good judge of character, And I don't think you could fake the kind of kindness I saw on that plane. People can't pretend to be decent when they're genuinely scared. Fear strips away all the pretense. She reached across the table and touched his hand gently. Vincent, I don't know what you're worried about, but I think you're a good person. Maybe you've made mistakes, everyone has, but I can see who you really are underneath, whatever you think you've done wrong. Her touch was warm, trusting, completely innocent of the blood on his hands. Vinny felt something break open in his chest, a dam that had been holding back 20 years of guilt and regret and carefully buried conscience. Emma, he whispered, I think you might be the most remarkable person I've ever met. And I think you're exactly the kind of person this world needs more of, someone with power who actually cares about using it to help people. If only she knew how catastrophically wrong she was about that. Vinny couldn't sleep that night. He stood on his hotel balcony until dawn, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic and trying to figure out how his carefully ordered world had become so completely complicated. Emma's words echoed in his mind. I think you're a good person. I can see who you really are underneath whatever you think you've done wrong. What if she was right? What if the man he'd become wasn't his true nature, but a role he'd been playing for so long he'd forgotten it was a performance? The boy who'd grown up in Little Italy hadn't dreamed of becoming a criminal. He'd wanted to be a teacher, to help kids learn and grow. When had protection become predation? When had survival become cruelty? His phone rang at 6 a.m. Tony's name appeared on the screen. Boss, we've got a problem. The Moretti family made a move on our South Side territory last night, hit 3 of our establishments, roughed up some of our people. Word on the street is, they think you've gone soft because of this Miami situation. Vinny closed his eyes. This was exactly what Tony had warned him about. Show any sign of weakness and the other families would circle like sharks. How bad? Bad enough. They didn't kill anyone, but they sent a message. Joey Castellano is asking for a meeting. Says he wants to discuss new arrangements for Chicago territories. Set it up for tomorrow night, usual place. Boss, you sound different. Everything okay down there? Everything was the furthest thing from okay. Just handle the Moretti situation until I get back. Don't escalate, but don't back down either. When are you coming back? Vinny looked out at the ocean, where early morning joggers were already beginning their routines along the beach. Normal people living normal lives, making normal choices about normal problems. Soon, I just need to finish something here first. After he hung up, Vinny made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. He called Miguel Rodriguez. We need to talk, Vinny said when Miguel answered. In person, today. I thought our business was concluded. It's not about business. It's about Emma. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Vinny wondered if the call had dropped. What about Emma? Miguel's voice was carefully controlled. I need to tell you something. Something that might change everything. They met at a small park near Coral Gables, away from the restaurants and businesses where either man might be recognized. Miguel arrived alone, which Vinny took as either a sign of trust or supreme confidence in his ability to handle whatever Vinny might try. You look like hell, Miguel observed as they sat on a bench overlooking a small pond where families were feeding ducks. I feel like hell. Vinny watched a young father teaching his daughter to throw breadcrumbs. Miguel, I've been seeing Emma. Nothing inappropriate, he added quickly, seeing the older man's expression darken. Dinner. Conversation. She thinks I'm setting up a scholarship fund. And what are you actually doing? Falling in love with your niece, which is the most selfish thing I've ever done, and that's saying something. Miguel studied him with those same intelligent brown eyes Emma had inherited. You're telling me this why? Because she deserves better than lies. Because you deserve to know what kind of man is spending time with her. And because I think I want to be worthy of her good opinion. Vincent, do you understand what you're saying? You're talking about walking away from everything you've built, everything you are. What if everything I am is the problem? A young mother chased her toddler past their bench, both of them laughing. The sound was pure joy, unmarked by violence or fear or moral compromise. There's something you should know, Miguel said quietly. Emma's parents died when she was 15. Car accident. I've been more than an uncle to her. I've been her father figure. Everything I've done, every choice I've made since then, has been to give her the life her parents would have wanted for her. Vinny felt the weight of that responsibility. She doesn't know about your business. No, and she never will if I can help it. Emma believes in good people doing good things. She believes the world can be better than it is. I've killed to protect that innocence. The casual admission hung between them. They were both killers, both men who'd chosen violence as a solution to problems, but Miguel had chosen it to protect something beautiful, while Vinny had chosen it to protect his own power. "I want to change," Vinny said. "I want to become the man she thinks I am." "That's not how change works, Vincent. You can't transform yourself for another person. It has to come from inside, from your own need to be better. Then I want to change for me. But I also want to change for her, and for every kid like her who deserves a world with fewer people like I've been." Miguel was quiet for a long time, watching the families around the pond. What would that look like, this change? I don't know yet. Walking away from the business somehow. Making amends for the damage I've caused. Maybe actually setting up that scholarship fund Emma thinks already exists. You realize the other families won't just let you walk away? I know. Tony already told me the Morettis are testing our defenses because they think I've gone soft. Have you? Vinny considered the question. Had he gone soft, or had he finally remembered what it felt like to be human? Maybe, but maybe that's not a weakness. Miguel stood to leave, then turned back. "Vincent, if you're serious about this, if you really want to change, you're going to need help. And you're going to need a plan that doesn't get you or Emma killed in the process. Are you offering to help?" "I'm offering to think about it. But first you need to prove to me that this isn't just infatuation with a pretty girl. You need to prove that you're serious about becoming a better man." After Miguel left, Vinny sat alone on the bench watching families enjoy their Sunday afternoon. Children played while parents watched protectively, creating memories that would last lifetimes. When was the last time he'd been part of something that innocent, that purely good? His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Had such a wonderful time last night. Thank you for dinner, and for listening to me ramble about psychology theories. You're easy to talk to." For the first time in his adult life, Vincent Torino wanted to be worthy of someone's good opinion more than he wanted to be feared. The call came at 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Vinny's phone buzzed with Tony's number, and he knew before answering that everything was about to fall apart. "Boss, you need to get back to Chicago, now." "What happened?" "The Morettis hit us hard last night. They took out 3 of our bookmaking operations and sent 2 of our guys to the hospital. But that's not the worst part." Tony's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "They grabbed Maria Benedetto." Vinny's blood turned to ice. Maria was old, Mr. Benedetto's granddaughter, barely 16 years old, who helped in the family store after school. She was the kind of kid Emma had been, hard-working, innocent, dreaming of college and a better life. Why would they take her? Message: "They know you've been distracted down there and they want you to understand that your absence has consequences. Joey Castellano called an hour ago. Says he'll trade the girl for a meeting, just you and him, no backup." Vinny was already reaching for his clothes. "It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap, but boss, we can't let them hurt that kid. Her grandfather's been paying us protection money for 15 years. If we can't protect him, what's the point of any of this? What's the point of any of this?" The question hit Vinny like a physical blow. What was the point? When had protection become extortion? And when had extortion led to innocent children being used as leverage in territorial disputes? "I'll be on the next flight out. In the meantime, reach out to our contacts in the police department. See if they can put pressure on the Morettis through official channels." "Already tried. Captain Morrison says his hands are tied unless we file an official complaint, which we both know we can't do. Because filing an official complaint would mean admitting their own illegal activities, opening up their entire operation to police scrutiny. They were trapped by the very system they'd created to avoid legitimate law enforcement. Boss, there's something else. The girl, Maria, she's been asking for you specifically. Apparently you helped her family out a few years back when her grandfather got sick. She thinks you're one of the good guys." Vinny remembered the incident. Mr. Benedetto had needed surgery, and the family couldn't afford to close the store for his recovery. Vinny had quietly arranged for some of his guys to help with inventory and customers, telling himself it was just good business to keep a reliable income source operational. But Maria had seen it as genuine kindness, writing him a thank you note in careful cursive that he'd kept in his office drawer. Now that same girl was sitting in some warehouse or basement, probably terrified, calling for a man she believed would save her. The man Emma thought he was, the man he'd never actually been. Vinny hung up and stared out at the Miami skyline, knowing he was about to walk back into his old life, just when he'd begun to imagine a different one. But he couldn't let an innocent girl suffer because of his choices, his weakness, his moment of conscience. He was packing when his phone rang again. Emma's name appeared on the screen. "Vincent? I'm sorry to call so early, but I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, about people changing and making amends." Her voice was soft, concerned. "You seemed so troubled when we talked about it. Is everything okay?" Everything was about as far from okay as it could possibly be. "Emma, I have to go back to Chicago. Emergency business situation." "Oh no. Is it serious?" "Very serious. Someone I'm responsible for is in danger." "That sounds terrible. Is there anything I can do to help?" Her immediate offer of assistance, despite barely knowing him, despite having her own studies and responsibilities, nearly broke his heart. This was who Emma Rodriguez was. Someone who offered help before asking questions. Someone who saw the world as a place where people should take care of each other. "No, sweetheart, but thank you for asking." The endearment slipped out before he could stop it, and he heard Emma's sharp intake of breath. "Vincent, be careful, okay? Whatever this business emergency is, just remember that some things are more important than money or success or winning. If only it were that simple." "I'll remember. Emma, if something happens to me, don't talk like that. Nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years. You made me remember what it feels like to want to be a better person." "Vincent, you're scaring me. What kind of business are you really in?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the lies he'd told and all the truths he couldn't speak. How could he explain that he was flying back to Chicago to face down a rival crime family? How could he tell her that an innocent girl was going to suffer because of the world he'd helped create? "The complicated kind," he said finally. "Emma, I need you to promise me something." "What? If you don't hear from me for a while, don't come looking for me, don't try to contact me. Just remember the good parts, okay?" "Vincent, what are you talking about? You're coming back to Miami, right? We're supposed to go to that art exhibition next week." The art exhibition. She'd mentioned it during dinner, how she'd never been to a real gallery opening, but always wanted to experience one. He'd promised to take her, another commitment he now might not be able to keep. "I hope so. I really hope so. Promise me." "I can't make promises I might not be able to keep." "Then promise me you'll try. Promise me you'll do everything you can to come back safely." "I promise I'll try." After he hung up, Vinny sat on the edge of his hotel bed and allowed himself one moment of complete honesty. He was in love with Emma Rodriguez. Not infatuated, not attracted, genuinely, completely in love with her optimism, her kindness, her absolute faith that people could choose to be good. And because he loved her, he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she never had to know what he really was. The flight to Chicago was turbulent, but this time Vinny barely noticed. His mind was focused entirely on Maria Benedetto and the choices that had led to this moment. Somewhere in the city he'd controlled for 15 years, a scared teenager was paying the price for his weakness, his moment of conscience, his brief glimpse of a different life. By the time the plane touched down at O'Hare, Vincent Torino had made his decision. He would save Maria Benedetto no matter what it cost him. He would face down Joey Castellano and the Moretti family, using every tool of violence and intimidation he'd perfected over the years. And then, if he survived, he would find a way to walk away from this life forever, because Emma Rodriguez deserved a world with fewer men like the one he'd been. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to become the man she thought he already was. The warehouse district on Chicago's south side looked exactly as Vinny remembered it. Abandoned buildings, broken streetlights, and the kind of desolate atmosphere that made honest people drive faster through the area. It was the perfect place for a confrontation that couldn't be witnessed, couldn't be reported, couldn't officially exist. Tony was waiting in the car when Vinny arrived from the airport, his face grim with the weight of bad news. The meeting's set for midnight at the old Castellano fish processing plant. Joey's people confirmed he'll have the girl with him, but boss, this stinks worse than day-old seafood. They want you isolated, vulnerable. Of course they do. That's how these things work. Vinny checked his weapon, muscle memory taking over despite the fundamental changes happening in his heart. What about our backup? Marco's got 3 guys positioned around the perimeter, but if things go bad inside that building, they won't be able to help much. Joey's probably got twice that many people. And the police contacts? Captain Morrison says they can't move without evidence of a crime. Officially, Maria Benedetto is just a missing person who might have run away. Her grandfather refuses to admit she was taken as leverage for our business operations. Of course he refused. Mr. Benedetto understood the rules of this world as well as anyone. Admitting to police that his granddaughter was kidnapped because of protection money would only make things worse for his family. "Boss," Tony said quietly, "you don't have to do this. We could hit some of their operations instead, make them understand the cost of taking civilians, and let them hurt Maria in retaliation. No, this ends tonight one way or another." They drove through the empty streets in silence, past the neighborhoods where Vinny had grown up, past the corner stores and small businesses that had paid him for protection over the years. How many of those payments had been voluntary, and how many had been fear disguised as cooperation? The fish processing plant squatted against the Chicago skyline like a cancer, its broken windows and rusted loading docks testament to the industrial decay that had created opportunities for men like him. Vinny had conducted business here before, negotiations that ended with handshakes and negotiations that ended with blood. Tonight felt different, final. Joey Castellano was waiting in the main processing floor, flanked by 6 men with guns drawn. He was younger than Vinny, maybe 35, with the kind of expensive suit and carefully styled hair that marked him as new money, trying to look like old power. Behind him, tied to a chair near the old conveyor belt, sat Maria Benedetto. The girl was terrified but unharmed, her dark eyes wide with fear, but still defiant. She looked so much like Emma, the same age, the same intelligent gaze, the same fundamental innocence that had no place in this world of violence and intimidation. "Vincent Torino," Joey called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "The legendary ghost of Chicago. You've been hard to find lately. I'm here now, let the girl go." Of course. Right after we discuss some territorial adjustments. You see, Vincent, your recent absence has created some uncertainty in the community. People are wondering if Chicago's protection is as reliable as it used to be. Vinny walked slowly forward, his hands visible, but ready to move if necessary. "The girl has nothing to do with business. She's a civilian. No such thing as civilians in our world, Vincent, you know that. Everyone's either an asset or a liability." Joey gestured toward Maria. "Pretty girl. Good student, I hear. Be a shame if something happened to her because her grandfather's protector couldn't protect." The casual cruelty in Joey's voice triggered something cold and familiar in Vinny's chest. This was the world he'd lived in for 20 years, where human beings were reduced to leverage and intimidation was a business strategy. For just a moment, he felt the old Vincent Torino rising to the surface, the man who would respond to threats with greater violence, who would escalate until his enemies were too broken to continue fighting. But then he thought about Emma's voice. I think even then, yes, but they'd have to genuinely want to make amends, to repair the damage they'd done. "What do you want, Joey?" "Simple. Your Southside territories, your bookmaking operations, your protection contracts. Basically, I want you to retire and I want your business. And if I refuse," Joey smiled, the expression cold and predatory, "then little Maria here learns what happens to people who get caught in the middle of territorial disputes. And after that, we start working our way through every civilian who's ever relied on your protection. Mr. Benedetto, his wife, maybe some of those college kids you've been helping with scholarships." The mention of scholarships made Vinny's blood freeze. How much did Joey know about his activities in Miami? How much danger had he put Emma in by pursuing this fantasy of redemption? "You've been doing research. I've been doing business. Unlike you, I don't let personal feelings interfere with professional obligations." Vinny looked at Maria, saw the tears she was trying not to shed, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She reminded him not just of Emma, but of his sister at that age. Young, hopeful, believing that the adults in her life would keep her safe. His sister had been wrong about that. The adults in her life had failed her spectacularly, and she'd paid the price. But maybe it wasn't too late to save Maria Benedetto. Maybe it wasn't too late to prove that Emma's faith in human goodness wasn't completely misplaced. "All right," Vinny said quietly. "You win." Joey's eyebrows rose in surprise. He'd clearly expected more resistance, more negotiation. "Just like that? Just like that. You can have the territories, the operations, all of it, but the girl goes home safe, and you leave the civilians alone. Forever." "Vincent, are you feeling all right? This doesn't sound like the man who built Chicago's most efficient operation." Maybe I'm not that man anymore. Joey studied him for a long moment, confusion replacing confidence. What's the catch? No catch. I'm done, Joey. You want my life's work? Take it. But you do it with honor or you'll answer to me. Honor? Joey laughed, but the sound was uncertain. What are you talking about, honor? We're criminals, Vincent. We're thieves and killers and extortionists. Honor is for people who can afford it. Maybe that's where you're wrong. Vinny walked slowly toward Maria, ignoring the guns trained on him. Joey's men looked to their boss for guidance, clearly uncertain how to handle a situation that had veered so far from the expected script. It's okay, Maria, Vinny said gently as he untied her restraints. You're going home now. Your grandfather is waiting for you. Mr. Torino, she whispered, they said you abandoned us. They said you didn't care about protecting people anymore. They were wrong about the first part, Vinny replied, helping her to her feet. And they were right about the second part, but not in the way they think. He looked back at Joey, who was watching this exchange with growing bewilderment. The territories are yours, Vinny said, but if you hurt innocent people, if you target civilians, if you become the kind of monster this business can make you, I'll come back. And when I do, it won't be for negotiation. Joey nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. Vincent. Why? Because someone recently reminded me that change without accountability isn't really change. This is my accountability. Vinny walked Maria Benedetto out of that warehouse and back into the world of ordinary people with ordinary problems. He drove her home personally, watching as she ran into her grandfather's arms, seeing the old man's tears of relief and gratitude. Mr. Torino, Mr. Benedetto said, as Maria disappeared inside to call her friends and assure them she was safe. What you did tonight, I don't understand it, but I'm grateful. Mr. Benedetto, you don't owe me anything anymore. Not money, not loyalty, not gratitude. You're free to run your business however you choose. The old man looked confused. I don't understand. I'm getting out of this life. Find legitimate security if you need it. Call the police if you have problems. But don't rely on men like me anymore. You deserve better, and so does your granddaughter. As Vinny drove away from the Benedetto store for the last time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace. Not the tense calm that came from having enemies under control, but genuine peace born of doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost. His phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen. Vincent, how did your business emergency go? Is everyone okay? Everyone's okay, he said, and for the first time in 2 decades, he was telling someone the complete truth. Emma, I'm coming back to Miami, and when I get there, I have a lot to tell you. Good things? Some good things. Some difficult things. But all true things. I'll be here, she said simply. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Together. Vincent Torino had spent his entire adult life believing that survival meant isolation, that power meant standing alone against the world. But maybe Emma Rodriguez was right. Maybe the strongest thing a person could do was trust someone else to help carry the weight. For the first time in his life, Vincent Torino was going home to someone who believed in his capacity for goodness, and for the first time in his life, he was determined to prove that faith justified.